All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about user input, how we can get user input in our programs. And there are mainly two reasons why I want to do this now. So first of all, it's quite useful going forward with our course to be able to get user input if you want to try different exercises with the different concepts that we talk about. Okay, so that's reason number one. Now, reason number two is that the Hello World example that we've seen so far, so this Hello World example is very, very simple. And while it gives you a small flavor of what the language is and how it does things, it doesn't really tell you too much, right? So I want to take a more complex example to show you kind of more aspects of the language. And even though you won't understand most of these concepts, it's still quite useful, I think, to get a flavor of how the language achieves its task. Now, one thing I want to mention before we get on with this is that Rust is not really a language that's designed for interacting with users, right? It's a language for memory management, it's for backend data processing, things like that. So the example that I'm going to give you might seem a bit more complex than necessary, okay? So while in a language like, for instance, Python, you might have a single line that reads an input from the console, here in Rust, you have a more complex structure, okay? And that's a disadvantage, but also an advantage. Since the language is not meant for user interaction that much, it will also give us a chance to see how we can achieve this task regardless. All right, so let's get started. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to import a library, okay? So I'm going to go here at the top and I'm going to say use std :io semicolon. Okay, so we're using the IO library from the standard library. Okay, so down here in the main function, we're going to declare a variable, and we're going to do this in this way. We're going to say let mute. Okay, that obviously stands for mutable, which means changeable. Input, you can name it whatever you like, is going to be equal to string :new parentheses semicolon at the end. Okay, so we're declaring a variable. Next up, we're going to print a message to the console. We're going to say print line with an exclamation mark at the end. Okay, and we're going to put something in quotes here. For instance, say something. Don't forget the semicolon at the end. Rust does require a semicolon after every statement. Okay, we're going to say match IO :stdin standard in dot readline, and here we're going to pass the mutable variable into which we want to receive the information. And we do it like this. We're going to put an ampersand mut, okay, so that's a mutable variable, input. Okay, we're going to open brackets here. Now, I'm going to explain what we're doing later on, but for now, we're simply going to say OK with an underscore inside brackets, equal greater than. We're going to open brackets here, and we're going to say something like print line, you said, open brackets inside the string, open curly braces, sorry, and then we're going to say the input here. So we're going to pass the input into our string and we're going to print it out. Then we're going to put a comma here and we're going to say error. We're going to have an E here and that will go into this block of code and we're going to print line a message in case of error. So something like something went wrong. We're going to put our curly braces and then we're going to put the error message and a semicolon at the end. Okay, so it might seem a bit complex, but let's just go with it. Let's run the code. So I'm going to right click and run. And here we get say something. I'm going to type hey, and then you said hey. Okay, so we read this string in our variable. All right, so let's go through it in a bit more detail and see what happens here. So obviously, we are importing the standard library, and from that, we are importing the IO module. Okay, so in our main, we're going to say let mutable input. So we're going to create a variable that we can change. Okay, we can change that value, and we're going to instantiate it with a string. If you've used any object-oriented programming language before, you might recognize this. It's the class string that creates a new element here. Okay, so string new. Then we're going to print something to the screen. This is actually what is called a macro. Okay, you might have used macros in other languages before, but we're going to talk about macros in more detail later on in our course. But we're going to print line, a simple message to the console. Then what we're doing is we're receiving the read line from the standard in library. Okay, we're receiving this in our variable input, and here we have a reference to our variable. So if you've used languages like C before, you will know what a pointer and a reference is. So we are referencing here the variable that we have declared earlier on. Okay, we want the value that we get from readline to go into this variable. Now, there are a couple of options that the system may return here. That is an OK, so if everything went fine, we are receiving the input, or we might get an error. So that's what we're doing here. We're checking to see whether we received an OK or an error, okay, with this match statement. Now, here, if we get an error, we're not really interested in the variable that this gives us. We're simply interested to print out the string you said, and inside the string, we're going to pass the value of the input variable. Okay, if we get an error, we do the same. We print out a string with an error message here. Okay, so that's what the program does. Okay, we're going to read something, but we have a error handling system as well. This is kind of built in to Rust. All right, so like I said, it might seem a bit complex. It might seem like overkill for such a simple task, but Rust is not really designed for this simple task. It's designed for something a bit more complex, and you can see kind of small glimpses of that here, where it forces us, even for a simple task like this, it forces us to handle errors in this way, right? Also, we can see from this example that Rust also uses references, it uses pointers, it uses mutable variables, and by extension, it uses immutable variables, right? It has macros, and so on and so forth. We can import various libraries, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a lot to talk about here. You're not expected to understand everything from this example. We will go into details about each and every aspect of the language that we have used here, and a lot more, of course, throughout the rest of our course.